My name is Tom, and I'd like to share a story from my college days. As you can probably imagine, it's not a very nice story, but I like to think that it's something others can take something away from, be that a life lesson or whatever else. I was pretty wild in college. You wouldn't think it if you looked at me, but it's true. I did okay in my freshman year, tried to keep my head straight and focus on my studies, but then the sophomore party lifestyle hit me pretty hard. I've also always looked a little older than I was, so although getting carded was standard on campus, if I drove into the city, I could pick up a six-pack almost anywhere. And that was not conducive to a healthy study and party balance. I would regularly find myself forced to walk home from some bar at 2 a.m., having spent all my money on shots with no charge on my phone to call a cab. A normal person might have that happen to them once, but me, it happened at least half a dozen times than I can remember. The last time, I had just gotten back onto campus after walking maybe 2 or 3 miles completely drunk, and I was incredibly tired. I was sobering up, in a terrible mood, and all I wanted to do was get back to my dorms so I could get to that bottle of vodka that I kept hidden in my dorm. But then, I run into this kindly stranger. There's a guy smoking a cigarette outside his block, and he says something sort of softly to me as I walk past him. It was something like, "Crazy night," or "Wild night," and I must have just grunted until I saw him smoking. I asked him to bum one and did so. Then we made a little small talk before he invited me inside for a beer and to charge my phone. This guy was still living in the dorms, albeit the nicer kind on the other side of campus, but having alcohol was still very much against the rules. Most heavy partiers had something stashed away somewhere, but this guy had a mini fridge that had beer cans tucked behind sodas. He said no one suspected him because he was such a nerd, and he was kind of right, I guess, because he didn't give off party vibes, but I just found myself seriously impressed. Well, more just wanting to have another beer before I walked the final 20 minutes to my dorm, but impressed nevertheless. I go up to this guy's room, and there it was, beer, hiding in plain sight. I asked to use the guy's bathroom before we drank, and he showed me where it was. And when I got back, we talked and drank, and at one point, I knew I probably should have started walking back, but I figured that I could just rest a little longer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the last thing I remember. I woke up the next morning in the hallway outside the guy's apartment. I was fully clothed, but my shoes were out there with me. It must have been late morning because it was pretty busy outside, meaning people definitely must have stepped over me while passed out in the hallway. I felt like death, and I probably looked about the same too. I know I attracted a few looks as I sort of moseyed across campus and back to my room. I've been really drunk before, but never blackout drunk, and let me tell you, it was not a good feeling. I haven't even put it together why I'd been cruising along just fine before that one beer knocked me out completely cold. I honestly just figured that I was exhausted from hours of drinking than miles of walking, but as I said, I had made that walk 5 or 6 times previous, probably having drank even more on some occasions, and I'd never blacked out like that until that night. I figured a lot of you probably have put it together already. Things are sometimes clearer from a distance like that, you know? But never underestimate the power of denial, especially when it comes to young men. I think a year went by before I was really faced with what had happened to me. I always knew in the back of my head, but like I'd already covered, I had that head buried firmly in the sand. In the 12 months or so since I blacked out, the same thing happened to multiple guys from our university and even some of the locals too. They were walking someplace late at night, ran into a kind of stranger who offered them beer or maybe a phone charge or whatever they just happened to need at that moment. They then went up to this guy's apartment or got into his car or whatever, and he offers them a drink. And then boom, they wake up hours later with no memory of the evening's events. You might think that it'd be those with clear ideas or suspicions that'd be the first to raise the alarm, but in reality, the opposite is true. The more of an idea that they had of what happened, the more compartmentalizing went on, allowing our seemingly kind stranger to get away with his crimes for a long time. It wasn't until a dude went to a doctor, having no idea why he hurt so much that the cops were even informed that something was going on campus. Then I don't know how, but they caught up with the guy, arrested him, and then the whole story was in the media within just a few days. The cops think this kindly stranger assaulted anywhere between 18 to 100 different assaults in the space of 2 years. And you read that right. 18 confirmed, 100 possible, and I heard almost a dozen were almost talked into testifying, but withdrew one by one in the run-up to the trial itself. Testifying would mean admitting what had happened to them, something that some guys just aren't willing to do. I guess that applies to both sexes, but it especially applies to men. I know that because I was one of those who withdrew. I figured if so many others were brave enough to say it out loud, I wouldn't need to. But that's not how it works. The kindly stranger who invited me into his dorm room that night got more than 500 years in prison on account of the 18 separate accounts that he was convicted of, plus a bunch of other crimes thrown in there too. It was good news to most, but to me, it meant facing up to what had happened to me, which honestly has been the single toughest thing I'd ever had to do. I've since worked with an organization called 1 in 6, named so because statistically, 1 in 6 men will be intimately assaulted or violated at some point in their lives. But because of how little we talk about it, you'd think the number is much, much lower. Well, it's not. And if the issues I just discussed affects any of your viewers, I strongly advise them to go visit www.oneinsix.org. There's a lot of advice and information there. Just don't close yourselves off and suffer in silence, because silence is the real killer. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.